Okay, let's unpack this. We've all heard of the big names, Kant, Fichte, and, certainly Hegel.
Mm,
But today we are diving into the figure who, in many ways, actually launched German idealism, F.W.J. Schelling,
right.
only to be totally overshadowed by the very system he helped create. And yet, the final comprehensive philosophical system he devised, a system largely forgotten, contains these radical, powerful, and frankly shocking answers to questions about freedom, existence, and, well, the destiny of our secular age that are astonishingly relevant right now.
It's an essential deep dive for anyone trying to understand the intellectual bedrock of modernity. We are zeroing in on one of the great philosophical dramas of the 19th century.
And that is Schelling's return to Berlin in 1841.
Exactly. This wasn't just a series of lectures, it was a showdown.
Mm.
This was the exact lecture hall where Hegel had reigned supreme for decades, right up until his death. So Schelling, who was once Hegel's mentor and, his friend, came back as the old guard, the original visionary, to present his final comprehensive system in a place just saturated with the ghost of his rival.
The stakes couldn't have been higher for German intellectual life, I imagine. Philosophy at that time was completely synonymous with finding the ultimate system, right? The final key to reality.
And the audience itself tells you everything you need to know about the expectations.
Mhm.
Our sources describe the room as being filled to capacity with, every intellectual luminary and young revolutionary of the age.
Just who are we talking about here?
You had established venerable scholars right next to the firebrands who would go on to define the next century. Think Friedrich Engels, Mikhail Bakunin, and critically for this story, Søren Kierkegaard. All of them just jostling for a spot in that lecture hall.
That mental image is incredible. They weren't just there for a technical critique of Hegelianism, which, Schelling had promised. They came hoping for ultimate wisdom, for the definitive, final answer. This was an era exhausted by speculative system builders, and they genuinely believed Schelling might deliver the holy grail of philosophy.
They absolutely did. They longed for an end to the quest for certain knowledge, for a definitive statement about human existence that was just irrefutable.
Mm.
German idealism, despite its original modesty about only offering the love of wisdom, had grown characterized by this profound confidence, maybe even an arrogance, in possessing absolute certain knowledge. So when Schelling stepped up, there was this collective, almost desperate hope that perhaps he, the original architect of the whole movement, had finally mapped the entire territory.
But the sources universally agree. He delivered something totally unexpected.
Totally.
And for most of the audience, it was wildly disappointing. What was Schelling's offering instead of that promised ultimate certainty?
He offered revelation.
Revel.
Yeah. He essentially told this room full of brilliant thinkers, and most of them were committed secularists, post-Enlightenment rationalists, that absolute ultimate certainty about fundamental things was simply not possible a priori. Not through pure deduction alone, at least not in the current state of intellectual development.
So what was the alternative?
Genuine wisdom, he proposed, could only be eschatological, a promissory note for knowledge that was still to come. Something revealed in history, not deduced from logic.
That must have been a devastating blow to the Hegelians. He offered what Paul famously called the wisdom of God, which is folly to humankind. He was basically telling them the search for absolute rational knowledge had hit a wall.
It was a true confrontation. A confrontation between the system of necessary logic and the contingent, messy reality of existence.
And Kierkegaard was there for this.
Kierkegaard, whom we mentioned, was thrilled initially. He wrote about a leap of joy when Schelling started discussing actuality. But then, even Kierkegaard felt this disappointment, because Schelling was essentially saying, I can't give you deduction. I can only prepare you for a free reception of revelation, which looks a lot like faith.
He was urging philosophy to prepare for a new kind of revelation, one no longer constrained by, say, historical, cult, or creed, but one that could eventually become universal knowledge.
Yes, and the mission of this late work was clear: to move beyond the certainty of pure reason and embrace the contingent existing real.
This is the core of our discussion, then. Schelling's turn to the positive.
Right.
We need to define this radical shift away from Hegelian necessity and toward a philosophy grounded in free decision, a philosophy that prioritizes existence over essence.
That's our anchor point. To understand the turn, we first have to understand the philosophical architecture he built, which begins by defining two stages of thought, and really two Schellings.
Let's get into that.
So we have to start with this historical separation. The sources often refer to Schelling the first and Schelling the second. Schelling the first is the early romantic philosopher of nature, the identity philosopher. He's focused on the great systematic whole of nature. This is the figure who was friends with Goethe and who tried to construct this unified, almost scientific system of all reality.
And then there's the transformation, Schelling the second.
Schelling the second emerges later, starting definitively around the 1809 Freedom Essay, and his central focus shifts entirely. His concern is no longer the systematic whole of nature, but the drama of revelation and existence.
So he's now dealing with history, contingency, the reality of human freedom and evil.
Precisely.
But he doesn't just discard his old ideas, which I think is key.
Absolutely not. And that's a common mistake. He integrates them, but they are fundamentally subordinated. He famously told a journalist, "The foundations that support me are the same, but I stand higher."
I like that.
The concepts from his early work, like the unification of mind and matter, they still exist, but they are now demoted. They become the ground or the antecedent rather than the final exhaustive essence of the new system. They're necessary, but they're insufficient.
So to understand this turn, we first have to understand the limits of what he now calls negative philosophy. What exactly is this and why is it insufficient?
So negative philosophy is basically the whole enterprise of German idealism.
His own work included.
His own early work, and of course the completed system of Hegel. It deals exclusively with essence, the Wahrheit, or whatness, and possibility. It is reason's internal system, a poem composed by reason itself.
A poem.
It's an exercise in pure logic where reason asks what must be true conceptually for reality to even be intelligible.
It sounds like a perfect, idealized mathematical model, something that works on paper.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It achieves conceptual certainty because it proceeds entirely in abstraction from existence. It is logically flawless, internally consistent, and it achieves a totality. I mean, it's the highest flight of rational thought. But, and this is the zinger,
Yeah.
as Schelling acidly notes, it is a philosophy that would be true if nothing existed.
Wow, a philosophy that's true in a vacuum.
Precisely. It creates a self-contained system of the rational. Schelling argues that reason possesses an a priori idea of God, which is the idea of the ens necessarium, the necessarily existing being, the being whose essence entails its existence.
Right. This concept of the infinite is reason's highest concept. But here is the critical philosophical error, the place where idealism oversteps its bounds. It assumes that the certainty with which it grasps this idea can bridge the gap to demonstrate the existence of that infinite being.
So he's really reviving and strengthening Kant's critique of the ontological argument here. The concept of the infinite is just the linchpin of the ideal system of nature. It's what thought must conclude, but that doesn't make it real.
Exactly. The idea of God is the highest achievement of thought, but it is not the really existing God. The great conceptual totality negative philosophy is conceptually absolute, but existentially inadequate. It fails to account for three crucial things that define our actual experience: historical actuality, contingency, and the reality of free existing persons. Right, because if all being were necessary, history would just be an unfolding of logic, and we wouldn't actually be free.
We wouldn't.
This sets up the necessity of the turn. The move to positive philosophy is not a simple logical step then, it's a leap.
It is absolutely not a rational or logical deduction. If it were, Schelling would fall right back into the Hegelian trap of claiming that all contingency is just part of a greater necessary rational plan. For Schelling, the transition from possibility, the negative, to actuality, the positive, is a moral imperative and an act of will by the philosopher. It is a free decision.
You have to choose to accept that the world is messy, contingent, and actually exists, even if your perfect logical system doesn't demand it.
The philosopher must freely decide to step out of the logical system and engage with the contingent, existing real. And refusing that move, staying safely within the rational structure of negative philosophy, that's a serious philosophical and personal risk.
What's the risk?
Schelling argues that the system of reason can logically make itself into a totality without an outside. If you refuse the turn, you risk becoming what he calls a neurotic subject, whose identity is constituted by ideological disavowal.
A denial of reality in favor of a comforting, self-contained logical construct. That really resonates today. We see people retreating into ideological echo chambers that are logically consistent but totally disconnected from the real world.
The symbolic world of pure logic offers tremendous comfort and certainty. But the turn is always a personal risk, a willing to be a certain kind of person who decides to live in a certain kind of world, one where genuine freedom and contingency are possible. The decision to embrace the positive means accepting that existence precedes and often, well, violates your best-laid logical plans.
So, to house this messy, real existence, Schelling had to invent a new logic, replacing Hegel's famous method. He swaps the Aufhebungsdialektik, the cancellation and preservation,
Mhm.
with the Irreductionsdialektik, or dialectic of generation. Let's unpack this, because it sounds like the motor of his entire final system.
This new dynamic, which is rooted in the law of the ground, is absolutely fundamental. Hegel's Aufhebung meant that when a concept, a thesis, met its opposite, the antithesis, the conflict was resolved through a higher concept, the synthesis, that both canceled and preserved the former two.
Right.
The whole system just marches forward toward the end of history in the absolute.
It's like an elevator perpetually moving up to the next floor.
That's a great way to put it. Whereas Schelling's Erzeugungsdialektik is about generation. The antecedent, so negative philosophy or potency, is displaced by the consequent, positive philosophy or actuality. But the antecedent isn't annulled. It remains forever potent and living, but perpetually subordinated to the consequent.
So the past philosophical system supports the current one, but it doesn't define it. It's the necessary enabling condition, the foundation, but not the realized structure.
Exactly.
Like a seed that generates a tree. The seed is still there, in a sense, but it is now the ground of the tree, which is a whole new reality.
Precisely. The antecedent has its actuality only in the fact that it has consequence. It's insuperably antecedent. It can't logically transcend itself into the consequence. And this relationship is crucial because Schelling uses it to define the three potencies, which are the building blocks of reason and ultimately the structure of God's being.
Okay, this is where the depth really comes in. Let's dedicate some time to these three potencies, starting with the first one.
Right. Potency 1, A. This is the concept of pure possibility, sheer determinability. It's what the scholastics called ens omnimo determinatum, the maximally determined being. It excludes nothing possible. It is bare identity, a prior to any differentiation.
The sources have a great analogy for this.
A fantastic analogy. It's the adolescent immobilized before the future who feels they could do anything precisely because they have done nothing. They're just undifferentiated potential.
And the crucial philosophical stake here is that this bare possibility includes the possibility not to be.
That's the key existential insight. Because it includes everything possible, it must be open to the possibility of annulling itself in actuality. Lacking actuality, it is impotent to carry itself into being. It's pure will zur Machtwill to power, but without the capacity for self-realization.
And if the absolute were just that, just potency 1,
It would either be immobilized by its own infinitude, or it would immediately pass into actuality and result in what Schelling calls blind being, like Spinoza's impersonal necessary substance.
which immediately implies a need for an opposing force, the thing that drives it out of mere possibility and into the passage of being.
That's potency 2 plus A. This is pure act, the idea of determinacy, pure being, or concept. It's the dynamic drive to exist. It represents the passage into being, but, and Schelling insists on this movement in thought signifies nothing in reality.
It's still just an idea.
It is still only being in the concept, not outside it. It is the perfect, fully determined plan, but it's still just ideal.
So potency 1 is the infinite potential, and potency 2 is the perfect conceptual blueprint. But the blueprint alone doesn't prove the existence of the house.
Precisely. The relationship between these two potencies is the core philosophical moment. The tension shows us that all being, even God's being, is contingent. No existence is necessary.
How so?
If potency 1 passed directly into necessary actuality, we would have Spinoza's blind being, a necessary deterministic cosmos. But because something finite, messy, and historical does exist, it implies a determination and a mediation that came into play, meaning that existence is conditional and free, not compelled.
The idea of a necessary being, the highest achievement of reason, still cannot prove that this necessary being exists in the real world of history and free action.
That's the floor he builds.
This is the intellectual ground Schelling provides for his ultimate claim, that existence demands a decision, a turn to the positive, one that pure logic can never achieve on its own.
And the groundwork we've laid sets the stage perfectly for his massive critique of Hegel, which is, it's often framed as a philosophical rivalry, but it's actually a deep metaphysical disagreement.
And the core of it is,
Schelling accuses Hegel of the ultimate category error, confusing the idea of God with the really existing God.
I wonder how a Hegelian would have responded to that, because Hegel claimed his system was exhaustive. He believed logic included history.
The Hegelians at the time argued that history is rational, that it follows a logical path, But Schelling's defense is that Hegel totalizes logic. He fails to acknowledge that nature, that history, that free decisions constantly interrupt logic.
They break the system.
They break the system. Logic cannot account for the sheer reality of the singular, unprothickable fact of creation. Hegel mistook the ens necessarium, the conceptually necessary sum of all predicates, for the really existing God.
So the idea of God is the ultimate concept, but it is still just a concept. Schelling is arguing that the actual God must precede and exceed any concept we can form of him, otherwise he isn't free.
If God were logically necessary, everything he does would be compelled by his own essence. Creation would be a necessity, not an act of love. And this dispute goes much deeper than just logic. It touches upon their fundamental disagreement on human psychology, identity, and personhood.
Especially Hegel's famous dialectic of recognition.
Yes, the master-slave dynamic.
Right.
For Hegel, a person requires recognition by another, a reciprocal I-thou relationship, to achieve self-consciousness. You only become you when another person confirms your existence. Therefore, this relation is necessary.
And by extension.
By extension, the Hegelian absolute, God, needs creation to become fully self-conscious. God only fully exists at the end of history as a result of self-mediation through his negation, which is the world.
This means, as you said earlier, that love in the Hegelian cosmos is driven by necessity, by need. I love you because I need you to confirm that I am myself. This sounds dangerously close to narcissism, or at least codependency, dressed up as metaphysics.
Schelling saw the catastrophic moral or theological implications of that. If recognition is necessary, then love and evil are both necessary movements in the cosmos.
Right.
If God needs creation, then creation, love, and redemption are compulsory moments in a logical unfolding. And Schelling argues that this just strips them of their moral character. If evil is merely a necessary negation in the grand divine logic, then it's not really evil. And if love is compelled, then it's not truly love.
So what is Schelling's alternative definition of personhood, his non-dialectical personalism? How does a person achieve being without that necessary external recognition?
For Schelling, a person is defined not by external relations, but by an internal, profound victory. A person is one who has overcome internal necessity, what he calls the dark ground or mastered internal chaos.
Wow.
The person is internally self-mediated. They have wrestled their foundational, chaotic, irrational forces into submission and coordinated them.
That concept, coordinated madness, is stunning. It suggests that a healthy self isn't a purely rational self, but one that has taken ownership of its own chaotic depths. It's an act of internal sovereignty.
It absolutely resonates with modern depth psychology. And it contrasts sharply with the Freudian idea of the self being constantly managed by repression, or the Hegelian idea of the self being constituted by external validation. For Schelling, this mastery must be achieved internally. The person is self-mediated, and thus is logically and morally free before entering relations.
Okay, so only on the basis of this profound self-mastery is a person capable of genuine, non-compulsory free relatedness.
Exactly.
This shift fundamentally redefines love itself, moving it from need to pure, radical freedom.
That's the essence of his definition of love. Since love is not driven by the need for self-confirmation, it becomes an expression of radical contingency and freedom. Schelling defines love as the secret that links such things of which each could exist for itself, yet does not and cannot exist without the other.
Wait, I need to linger on that. It links two things, each of which could exist independently, but they freely choose not to.
Yes.
That means separation is always possible, but the union is maintained by freedom, not by necessity.
Yes. The two are ontologically individuated and could exist separately, but they freely decide for a union that grounds an indissoluble internal relation. And this has massive implications for how God relates to the world. God loves the world by freely deciding to be vulnerable to it, forging a link maintained by freedom, not compulsion. God is personal and self-sufficient before creation.
This philosophical dispute between necessary relations for Hegel and free relations for Schelling seems so foundational that it's surprising to hear it revives an ancient theological controversy, which our sources highlight, the 4th century debate over the Trinity at the Council of Nicaea.
This is where Schelling reveals the deeply theological roots of his anti-Hegelian philosophy. He is arguing that the core philosophical fight of the 19th century is simply a rerun of a 4th century debate.
So the sources map Hegel onto Athanasius and Schelling onto the subordinationists, figures like Origen and Arius. That's a highly controversial alignment. Can you explain the difference for someone who might not know the Nicene context?
Absolutely. The Orthodox Nicene tradition, championed by Athanasius and which Hegel essentially mirrored, insisted on necessary and reciprocal relations among the persons of the Trinity. The Son is eternally bound to the Father, co-equal and co-eternal, in the unity of the Spirit. God is Trinity by logical necessity.
And this necessity was vital for Orthodox doctrine.
Vital, because if the Son was not co-eternal and necessary, it introduced an element of contingency into the divine nature, which was considered scandalous.
And Schelling aligns with the subordinationists Origen and Arius, who were deemed heretical. Why?
They asserted the primacy of the Father and the radical freedom of the Trarian relations. They believed the begetting of the Son was not a logical emanation required by God's essence, but a contingent, free, unprethinkable act of the Father. Schelling rehabilitates this view to protect the absolute freedom of God. If the Son's obedience, for example, is not compelled, but is a free, contingent decision, then freedom is placed at the very origin of the divine, setting the standard for the entire cosmos.
So if freedom is prior to necessity in the divine life, it means God is not trapped by his own perfection. And this links directly to the idea of kenosis, or divine self-emptying, in the Christ event.
For Hegel, the incarnation was God identifying with the world, leading to the collective human realization of the divine. Schelling sees this as a philosophical reduction. For him, the incarnation is an act of divine kenosis. God becomes potency for the actuality of the human.
How does that look practically in the story of Christ?
In the incarnation, the infinite absence itself, it retreats into non-actuality, or at least a subordinate actuality, so that the Christ, the human element, might genuinely exist as a free person.
So the union doesn't abolish difference or collapse the two natures like Hegel suggested.
No, quite the opposite. It affects their separation and restoration to proper dignity. God renounces the claim to domination. He self-empties so that the human can be fully free and fully human. It's the ultimate act of love as radical contingency.
So the cross is the supreme demonstration of self-giving love, a free and powerful act, rather than just a necessary logical step in divine self-recognition.
Right.
It makes the reconciliation between God and creation possible, precisely because both parties are allowed to maintain their distinct free dignity.
So, since the move into positive philosophy is not a logical deduction but a free decision, Schelling needs a new way to prove the reality of the existing God. He's already rejected the ontological argument for leaping from concept to existence.
So he invents a non-deductive, non-inductive method.
He calls this metaphysical empiricism, which is an early formulation of what C.S. Peirce later perfected as abductive reasoning. This method rejects the atomistic empiricism that reduces experience to just discrete, unassociated data. Abduction is reasoning from consequent to antecedent.
Okay, define abduction for us.
It starts with a surprising fact, which is the explanandum, the thing that needs to be explained. You then risk a speculative explanation, the explanandums, that must go beyond the immediate data to account for the whole ontology.
So the question is turned around.
Completely. It's not what must follow from God, but what must God be such that nature, history, and personal existence as we know them are possible.
What is Schelling's ultimate surprising fact that demands a divine explanation?
It's the sheer, stunning fact that existence exists.
The classic philosophical question, why is there something rather than nothing?
That's the starting point. But more than that, the world is ordered, full of beauty, personal meaning, and irregularity, and it need not be. The old concept of a timelessly perfect, necessary God leaves the irregularity and imperfection of nature unexplained, or worse, it explains it away as just an illusion.
So his proof must be continuously tested against the messy reality we experience. It's not static.
Absolutely. Schelling calls this the running proof for the existence of God. Since the realm of reality in which this proof moves, which is nature and history, is continually advancing, the proof is also never finished.
So it's always growing.
It is continuously growing, strengthened with every step of experience. It only continues to work, and it is only true to the degree that it continues to explain everything that needs to be explained about actual existence.
This concept of knowing God a posteriori, through the consequence, is so much more dynamic than mere logical proof. And it's tied directly to how we know the character of any person, which is an analogy that's central to his work.
That analogy is vital for bridging the gap between philosophy and theology. We cannot know God a priori because God's existence is a free, contingent act. We know God a posteriori, or per posterius, just as we know the character of another person.
You can have an idea of what a person should be, but you don't really know them until they freely reveal themselves through their sensible acts in time.
Their true character cannot be anticipated a priori. You can't logically deduce their next free decision. It is revealed only through their free acts in time.
Hmm.
And God's self-revelation is carried out through the contingent creation and redemption of the world. For Schelling, this makes revelation a natural, understandable phenomenon once it occurs, albeit an extraordinary one. The separation of philosophy from theology, he argues, is no longer tenable because revelation has fundamentally penetrated our empirical understanding of history.
Before leaping entirely into the realm of history and revelation, Schelling insists that negative philosophy has an essential practical role to play. It's a kind of spiritual preparation.
He calls this the practice of infinity, or negative spirituality. It is an interior, eternal spirituality, valid everywhere, found outside of history. It's an internal discipline of transcending the finite, our concepts, our desires, a fixed sense of identity, our fears, to achieve an experience of the infinite. It's a method for dealing with that inner chaos we talked about earlier.
This sounds exactly like mystical traditions from all across the world.
It is. Schelling links this non-dual experience, where one transcends the dualisms of subject-object, self-author to figures like Heraclitus, Shankar in Vedanta, and the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart. The experience requires moving beyond the grasp of grammar, logic, and dualistic theology to a non-dual level of thought that can only be expressed paradoxically.
So how does Schelling, as a Christian philosopher, distinguish this non-dualism from monism, which often leads to the idea of the drop merging back into the ocean?
That distinction is critical. Monism, like Spinoza's pantheism, or sometimes strict Advaita Vedanta, it denies duality, claiming reality is strictly one impersonal thing.
Right.
Schellingian non-dualism presupposes duality. It accepts the existence of the one and the other, but it denies that they are mutually exclusive. It denies that there are two or many things that are eternally separated. The negative practice needs both opposites, self and non-self, form and emptiness, to make the point that they are essential moments of being, but not ultimately opposed.
And the spiritual function of this practice, why is it a necessary prerequisite for the positive turn?
The mystic, in experiencing his or her own infinity, remains finite. They remain conscious of the negativity of the experience. It teaches profound humility. This experience of the absolute is the necessary ethical and spiritual presupposition for receiving the positive truth of personal revelation.
So you have to empty yourself of the pretension that you can rationally deduce God before you can receive him through a free historical act.
That's it.
The danger of staying only in the negative, then, is dissolution.
Exactly. Dissolution in an impersonal absolute. Schelling argues that what is most religious and most real in us is what is most personal. We long not for dissolution into an impersonal absolute, but for perfect personal relation love with a personal Trinitarian God. The negative prepares the ground by clearing away our false expectations, but the positive delivers the actual fulfillment in history.
Okay, moving now to the final implications of the positive philosophy, the destiny of history itself. Schelling starts by giving us a historical timeline, and it begins with a reevaluation of myth.
Mythology, for Schelling, is the earliest, most bound form of religious consciousness. He doesn't dismiss it as superstition. He sees it as a genuine, collective determination of consciousness by the divine. The divine is encountered unconsciously in symbolic figures like Demeter or Dionysus.
Right.
It's the history of humanity being separated from God, resulting in the descent into polytheism and diverse national myths. The plurality of gods, he argues, was a legitimate but confused experience of the divine potencies within God.
So mythic consciousness is necessary, legitimate, but pre-personal and confusing.
Yes. Revelation, the appearance of Christ, brings the mythological age to an end. It awakens humanity from myth and shows the mythic past for what it was, a necessary ground that has been superseded by a free act in time.
And this framework leads to his astonishing claim about modernity, that secular culture is the fruition of Christianity, not its negation.
This is a radical, almost prophetic insight for the 19th century. Schelling argues that the disenchantment of the world is the natural, necessary trajectory of Christendom.
Huh.
Christianity, by providing a personal God who transcends the mythical forces of nature, frees humanity to analyze and control nature.
So how does that connect to secular culture?
Modern secular culture, through its advancements, realizes in a secular key all that was once deferred to the afterlife: universal freedom, justice, communion.
That flies directly in the face of conservative critiques of secularism, particularly the idea that secularism replaces God with false gods like health and wealth.
Schelling offers a brilliant counter-critique. He argues that those seemingly weak hearth gods of health, wealth, and pleasure, which conservatives often lament, are not false gods at all. They are simply the base common denominator of goods we can all agree are genuinely good and should be universally distributed.
Huh.
They represent an ethical step forward because they are shared, banal, and globally emancipatory. They are the realization of practical, universal charity.
That is a remarkable reframing. It means the pursuit of health and comfort isn't necessarily idolatry, it's the application of Christian charity to the universal human condition.
And this leads to his powerful diagnosis of any attempt to halt or reverse secular progress. If populism or nationalism pushes back against this disenchantment by calling for the return of strong gods, absolute, uncompromising national or mythic identities, Schelling views that as a pathological regression.
Flight from the reality of the present age.
Exactly. It's a flight from the real situation of interconnected global civilization, which is called to greater trust and ecological universalism. Mythic consciousness belongs to the past, not the destiny of a rational, free modernity.
Let's pivot to his political thought. Schelling is described as a political eschatologist. How does this differ fundamentally from utopian thinkers like Comte or Marx, who were his contemporaries?
The distinction is vital. Utopian thinkers believe that humans possess the political or technical means to bring about the end of history, the perfect society.
Right, through human effort.
Schelling, like the medieval figure Joachim Fiore, is an eschatologist. He trusts in a future transformation that transcends human means. Given the deep corruption of humanity, its incapacity for self-perfectibility after the fall, or original sin, we lack the practical means to mend society ourselves. We need to be transformed in our very essence.
This deeply pessimistic view of human nature dramatically impacts his view of the state itself. If humans can't govern themselves perfectly, what is the role of the state?
The state, for the later Schelling, is a product of the historical fall. It is necessary, but it functions primarily as a punishment for sin to maintain a modicum of justice and present chaos. It's an external necessity imposed on humanity due to our own internal disorder.
So his vision of the state is...
It should be kept as small and checked as possible.
This connects back to his metaphysics of ground and consequent, the dialectic.
Yes. The state serves as the necessary ground, the antecedent for society and individual moral life. It must be held in check by due political process, and it must never usurp the grounded, which is the individual's free moral life and the community of love.
So the state is like nature.
It is like nature, of the order of necessity and force. The individual feels its rule as force, but attempting to overthrow it violently results in a worse situation. Anarchy, the denial of necessary conditions. The ground must be respected, but never allowed to become the ultimate fulfillment.
And his view on legitimate sovereignty is astonishingly humble, connecting directly back to that idea of kenosis.
Legitimate sovereignty, like the son's relation to the father, is kenotic. It's self-emptying. The earthly sovereign must renounce domination, giving up the leisure and freedom of ordinary life to serve the whole. The ruler must lower himself and identify with the least among those they rule.
So that's the divine archetype for any genuine form of sovereignty.
It is the renunciation of a claim to divinity and self-aggrandizement. The sovereign must serve as the ground for freedom, never its master.
Finally, what is the ultimate goal of history? What is this perfect community that Schelling anticipates, which transcends both state and church?
He anticipates the culmination of human history in the Church of St. John. This succeeds the Petrine Age, which is Catholicism representing external authority, and the Pauline Age, Protestantism representing internal faith. This third age will see the simultaneous demise and fulfillment, the closure and the telos of both the church as external authority and the state as a necessary political force.
So not anarchy, but a spiritual completion, the advent of what he calls philosophical religion.
Exactly. This future will be a pluralistic, religiously secular age where a completely free reception of revelation unites all human communities. The unity will be achieved by means of diversity, restoring the unity lost in the fall, while allowing each individual the dignity of their own ethnic and religious origins.
So the internalization of the Christ event unites humanity.
Right, and it fulfills and validates the varieties of religious traditions that led them there. It's a truly post-Christendom prophecy of secularism, grounded in radical divine freedom.
It forces us to reconsider the meaning of the word secular. For Schelling, it's not the absence of religion, but the eventual culmination and universal appropriation of revelation by free reason.
Yeah.
So, let's tie this all together. What is the fundamental, immediate relevance of Schelling's final system for the listener today for how we understand ourselves?
I think Schelling forces us to question the source of our sense of self. Is our identity based on necessary social recognition, the constant need for external validation from others, as Hegel argued? Is it a continuous, anxious I-thou dialectic?
Hmm.
Or is it based on a profound internal mastery of chaos, a self-mediation achieved before we ever enter a relationship?
The difference is everything. The first answer implies that love is instrumental. We love because we need to complete or confirm ourselves. The second implies that love is radically free, contingent, and self-giving.
Right.
We love because we choose to give ourselves away, even when we could exist perfectly well for ourselves. Schelling provides the philosophical architecture for radical, non-codependent freedom.
And that takes us to our closing thought. Schelling's work suggests that our most modern, secular philosophical psychology, our political theory, our understanding of the free, individuated person who is internally self-mediated and thus logically and morally free in relation to the other, unconsciously depends upon forgotten, ostensibly heretical theological controversies from the 4th century.
The debates between Athanasius and Arius, necessity versus freedom in the divine being.
Precisely. The core drama of divine relations, the question of whether God is bound by necessity or defined by radical contingent freedom, still haunts and shapes our most basic secular assumptions about human dignity and self-determination. We are still wrestling with the destiny of those divine dramas that Schelling brought back to the philosophical surface in Berlin in 1841.
And that, I think, is a deep dive worth musing on long after we finish this conversation.